All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are coming together to discuss becoming a non-founder CEO with current and former CEOs from AllTrails and Weedmaps. And we're really excited that you were able to join us. Just as a warning, this webinar is being recorded. It will be sent out to everyone who registered to attend. And please feel free to submit any questions that you have in the Q&A box. If our panelists are able to address it during the conversation, they will, but no promises. If you want to go to the next slide, Ellie. I will pass the baton to our founder and CEO here at Ruckus, Anish Shah, so that he can tell you a little bit about himself and introduce our panelists.
Thanks a lot, Casey. Really quickly, my background was previously working in-house and as a consultant doing growth and marketing for different companies, and then stumbled onto building an executive recruitment shop. Been running this for a few years, and we're a team of 16 worldwide.
Hey guys, my name is Ron. I am the CEO of AllTrails. I've been there since 2015. Prior to that, I was at Yelp for a second running growth over there. Before that, I had a startup in the ski space called Liftopia, which I did for 9 years. Yeah, excited to share my learnings on my journey, and hopefully this is helpful and interesting for you guys.
Hey everyone, Chris. I was most recently the CEO of Weedmaps. I can't say where yet, but I'm actually soon to be a non-founder CEO at another vertical SaaS and marketplace company. But in terms of background, I was originally a transactional and startup attorney focusing on healthcare, life sciences, technology. I then went to a PE-style credit fund where I did advisory work to companies primarily in the tech space, and that led to me meeting the Weedmaps co-founders and coming in where I spent 7.5 years at Weedmaps, initially co-running the company with one of the co-founders, and then running it solo, where I scaled the company, did a sort of SaaS roll-up of about 5 or 6 software solutions on the B2B side. And then took the company public on NASDAQ in 2021. So it's great to be here.
Awesome. And when all of you registered for this event, we asked you to put a question in that you wanted to ask our experts. And from all of the RSVPs, we pulled out the most interesting of the questions and put them here in this deck. I'll be going through a few of them. So really getting right to the point, how did you land your first non-founding, CEO role? I know every single person who ends up in this comes from a bit of a unique path. And I know both of your paths have been unique, and both of you were promoted into your roles. So we'd just love to learn a little bit more about that journey from both of you, of getting there in the first place.
Chris, you want to go?
I can jump in. I alluded to it a little bit. So when I was at the credit fund, the co-founders, Weedmaps came in and pitched me. And I think as I looked at the space, I had a couple of views. I think one, they were a fairly Yelp-like business at the time. And I said, look, if we were to do an investment, I think that there needs to be a transition to this, and there can be a transition to being an e-commerce business. It'll be complex, but it's possible. And separately, looking at the SaaS solutions that were needed to kind of feed into doing e-commerce, so point of sale, inventory management, customer lifecycle management, CRM, that sort of thing, essentially all greenfields. And I realized that the regs were so complex that unless the software was built for the space, you weren't going to be able to cross leverage it from outside. Ultimately, they liked that vision and that sort of path, and they basically came to me and said, look, we need help professionalizing, growing the company, and we like the strategy that you outlined. And so will you come aboard? And so it was with the intent that I would initially kind of co-run it with one of the co-founders, but with a view that I would take over as CEO. So that was sort of one, how I came in, and I think two, the expectation set, which was a little bit unusual in that I was, kind of being brought in to be the CEO, but not being the CEO right away.
Interesting. So was there sort of an expectation that there would be a a draw towards that, and a timeline, or it was a bit more implicit versus explicit, that it would be sort of a bit of a ramp towards it?
I think it was all fairly explicit, but I think
Okay.
what I saw was, and this is a common path, and we'll get into this a little later, and you see it manifest in a lot of ways, is founders tend to like have trouble letting go of the handlebars on the bicycle. And so I think
Yeah.
the length of time that it took for that transition was probably more reflective of that. There's also a lot of wood to chop to get things done, but that's the biggest example of reluctance to let go of the handlebars, is actually passing the baton. And often that won't be the case because the board is anointing the change, or there's something different happening. You can see it happen in a lot of smaller ways, like reluctance to change product development process or product launch and life cycle iteration. Little things like that have sort of been apocryphal in terms of how they've been done, and resistance to change. It's just, in my case, the thing that was the initial resistance of change was actually the full CEO transition.
Fair. Thanks a lot. And then Ron?
Yeah. So like I said briefly in the intro, I had a startup in the ski space called Liftopia. I was there for about 9 years, and outdoor tech is pretty small, right? Like we all kind of just know each other. And I was working at Yelp, and realized like I got to go to someplace smaller, someplace faster. And serendipity happened. The founder of AllTrails hit me up. And he's like, hey, this thing is just starting to take off, and I want to bounce. I'm going to go take an offer to be SVP of operations at one of the big food delivery companies. So do you want to take over the company? And I was like, no, I'm not a CEO, but I'll be like, I can unlock this for you. Like, I'll be your CMO, and I'll take the COO role too, because I want agency over organizing the org to do what we need to do. But yeah, no, like I don't want to be CEO. So he went and he's like, cool, I'm still going to bounce. So I'm going to find a CEO. And he did. And the two of us started on the same day. The agreement was to grow it and sell it. Right. So we kind of thought it would be like a quick turnaround thing. And so we did sell it. In October 2018, we sold it to Spectrum Equity. And right after that transition took place, I think we all kind of agreed that the CEO, it's probably time to transition him out. And so Spectrum pulled me into their office. They're like, hey, Ron, we think it's time to transition the old CEO out, and we want to make you CEO. And I said, no, I'm not a CEO. And they're like, what are you talking about? And it was funny because like I had a startup, like I said, and even then, we were co-founders for like 4 years, and finally the board's like, hey, one of you needs to be CEO. It's like, I'm not CEO. And I always had this idea in my head, I'm not qualified to be CEO, specifically because I suck at finance. I just suck at finance. I got a C+ in econ in college. My wife works in finance, and I just glaze over every time she starts talking about I can't even tell you like how a convertible note works today. Like, it's just not my forte. But the private equity is like, we're the finance guys. You don't even have to worry about that. We'll take care of that for you. Like, we just want you to do your thing, right? The things that you're good at. So I begrudgingly took on the role, and I haven't looked back. So that's how I got it. It was kind of thrust upon me.
I love that. That's really amazing, because it touches upon really 2 areas. Number one, the most obvious one is imposter syndrome, right? And everyone thinking, wait, that's someone else. That's this other like shiny, guiding, massive light, the person who has the right degree and seems to have their shirt tucked in the right way, and like speaks a certain way in a meeting and can do every single thing. And I think a lot of us have that picture in our head of that proper CEO. And I myself have a lot of imposter syndrome around that as well, because I'm not that person. And all the things that you mentioned you're terrible at, I'm horrendous at. I barely, I barely understand my own taxes and our corporate taxes. And every time I'm going through it with our accountants, like, what, why? None of this makes any sense. So I totally engage with that right there. And I think it's almost weird when someone doesn't have a little bit of imposter syndrome. It's like, why are you this confident? And there's like something a little bit wrong if they're that confident that they can just do it without necessarily having the right chops. But number two, that sometimes doesn't get hit on enough is working and just showing you're really good at what you're doing and other people noticing without asking for it, without punching the door and saying, where's my promotion? Where's my next thing? Always looking for that next shiny thing. And I think it's tough. You can't always just work and work towards something and, expect other people to recognize you. But, oftentimes that's exactly what happens when you are kind of that star. And I've worked with a few people who I think some of the biggest stars I've worked with have never really asked for anything. They've just consistently throughout their career been recognized by others. It's like, wow, this person just absolutely crushes. And yes, they are actually a lot more talented than they even give themselves credit for. And they get lifted up to some of these areas. And clearly, you went in the seat and you showed how good you were at what you do, and everyone else recognized it, including investors who consistently are placing CEOs in these roles. And they could have gone and found an outside executive search firm like us and been, let's bring in, someone who's more CEO-y or, has been a CEO multiple times before. But they're like, no, let's beg Ron for the third time and let him realize that this isn't someone else, this is him. So I love that. Imposter syndrome gets talked about all the time, but I think the other part of just showing up and doing the work, and people will actually notice if you are doing it well, without you having to go screaming out of the rooftop that, guess what, everyone, I'm good at what I do. So I love that story right there, that you had to be begged multiple times to do that. And yeah, congratulations, because I'm seeing AllTrails pop up way more, and I'm getting a lot more notifications from the app, and I'm sure all of you are monetizing way more. And that's from your efforts and pushing as hard as possible. And yeah, Chris, I don't know if you had any additional comments there. Like, I don't know if you felt a little uncomfortable, obviously. And for those who don't know Chris's background, it's very much in the legal space previously. So I don't know how that transition was for you, coming from heavily in the legal and investment space, coming into an operational role in a tech company.
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I was giving operating advice so I kind of switched from being a lawyer to being finance person. And actually that fund, not for long. But I think part of the reason I came to that fund is I'd actually done 2 deals for them as a lawyer, and they liked that I was kind of giving operating advice, or kind of trying to keep the proverbial screwdriver out of the electrical socket. And so I've always liked or had a bias towards the operating side. But I think, to be honest, I think one of the nice things about coming in from the legal background is you get to be the fly on the wall for a lot of people doing stuff right, but often doing stuff wrong. And I think just having like that level of sort of visibility and the ability to see people either trying to clean up messes that probably shouldn't have happened in the first place, or going through on an M&A deal that then it all, goes pear-shaped on the post-merger integration. Strangely, I think it was helpful for me to just see a lot of folks get a lot of turns, sometimes doing it right and sometimes doing it wrong.
That's great. Yeah. And you see a lot of people coming from that side, the management consulting side of the finance side, jumping into in-house because they've had that bird's eye view. So it sounds like that worked out really well for you. Great. Let's jump to the next one. Chris, I think you just answered this about how your legal and finance background kind of prepared you. Ron kind of came up more of the marketing and growth path, but also co-founding another outdoor organization that focused on digital e-commerce. But running marketing and co-founding a company might be a little bit different than being a CEO. So I guess I would actually ask this question, how your previous experience prepared you, but also like, how did it not prepare you? Like what's sort of different about your role now than what you were doing previously? Because you did have quite a bit of purview in a couple of your roles.
Yeah, the funny thing about going up the chain, even like within a specific category, CTO, CPO, CMO, is that when you get to senior leadership, the the skills that got you there aren't really part of your day-to-day job at all anymore, right? Like the whole thing about going up is learning to let go, and you have to kind of like continuously like fire and rehire yourself and learn all these new skills. Because again, if you're holding on too tight, you're not giving enough daylight or oxygen to the, you know, world-class team that you're supposed to be hiring and giving them autonomy and agency to work their craft, right? Like, and it's the same thing with the CEO, right? So on the one hand, there were some things that helped prepare me. For example, understanding boardroom dynamics, right? Like at Liftopia, my previous startup, I wasn't CEO, but I was obviously a board member and in the board meetings. And you know, that, I mean, that's a whole other podcast, but that's like a trial by fire thing, right? And you learn what works, what doesn't work, what to look out for, how to constitute a board that's productive and, you know, all aligned, whatever, right? Same with cross-functional collaboration, right? Like that's a really key thing. And again, as you go up the chain in whatever your respective field is, it's not just about like your silo anymore. It's like, how does your silo fit into the whole? A lot of soft skills, you know, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but kind of recognizing the importance of like body language and energy and just like how what you put out there gets viewed by everyone around you, right? And how to even like lead without necessarily having direct influence, you know? So a lot of that stuff is accessible to anyone who's just going up the chain. Like the best thing you can do is just get a seat at the table. Like that's what's going to prepare you for CEO. I think, I don't know the level of experience with folks, you know, listening in today. A lot of people coming up, you know, when they think about getting into management, they think about people management. People management kind of sucks, in my opinion, right? Like you're dealing with HR issues, you're dealing with people crying. Like it's not fun. People management isn't fun. What's fun is strategy and having a seat at the table, right? And having impact and influence. And that's really, I think, the key part on the come up that you got to like really kind of lean into and get exposure to. And once you start kind of getting some repetitions there, the transition to the CEO role gets a little bit easier, but it's a completely different role. And you have to learn from scratch. And, you know, the imposter syndrome is real for a reason, right? Because it's completely different. But the other thing is like every CEO has to start somewhere, right? Like everyone has their first CEO gig. And so getting to the CEO role is really just, it's the start of the process. You know, it's not the end, it's not the finish line. But what you pick up along the way can definitely help, you know, determine your success in the seat.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I think there is this idea that CEOs love to manage and love to be overseeing massive teams, and that's almost part of the appeal for the role. And for some people, I do see that. And when we interview people who are at a C level and who are executives, we talk about, okay, well, what are you interested in? What are your career goals? A lot of them do talk about coaching and mentoring. But I would say most of the CEOs we work with, and usually our clients are the CEOs of the companies or the co-founders. I don't think they really enjoy the people management aspect at all. It's something that like really drives them crazy. And so to be honest and say that, like it is a big portion of stress, and can be a lot to take on when you just want to steer a great company and a great product and drive great numbers. It definitely means a lot. And the fact that you now have to, before you're maybe managing marketing and growth folks, now you got to manage finance folks. Now you've got to manage engineers. Now you've got to manage these wider variety of people who have skill sets that you don't have. It's very stretching. How about yourself, Chris? You know, you already talked about a little bit about how your previous experience prepared you, but you know, how did it not prepare you? What are some things you sort of experienced in that journey where you're like, oh, this is new?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think on the legal and finance side, you tend to be a little slower to fire, slower with like people ops moves, and especially as Weedmaps grew from 60 folks when I came in up over 600, you kind of got to grip it and rip it a little bit on reorgs or restructurings and that sort of thing. And it's something that until you kind of get pass through on doing it, you're not going to know. The other thing is, and it doesn't, like, I think this is a very common pattern with becoming a CEO, is there's a lot of changes that don't like loudly announce themselves. And like one of them is the minute you take that title, it doesn't matter. You can, I've always considered myself a very people-oriented leader and very approachable. You automatically take a 50% reduction in your approachability. It's just the title, especially as new people come in, you become more intimidating. And so to the extent you relied on tribal knowledge or the ability to kind of like touch and feel and intuit what was happening in the org, that sensory apparatus just got a lot worse. The other thing is, and I think Slack and things like that, especially in work remote environments, can make this really worse, is, usually when you're in a non-CEO role, you can kind of opine on stuff or say stuff, and people will kind of be like, cool, like, let me sort that in the factors that I care about, but it's not dispositive. And when you become CEO, a lot of times the random musings you say can be viewed as dispositive. You have to be extremely careful and reserved. And so to the extent, much like Ron, I like the strategy. I especially like product strategy, product roadmap development, how you improve launching products. That's naturally I think as companies grow, it becomes very data and iterative experimentation driven. And you have to be really careful, because a CEO, you can be like, what this? And then suddenly like that becomes a thing. And you hear like the number of times as we grew bigger, I'd be like, why are we doing this? And they'd be like, well, so-and-so said that you said we had to do it. Or like these things would start. And so naturally I found myself, and it didn't prepare me for this, but I think having to be much more thoughtful in terms of what I said, in terms of like, do I want this to potentially get legs and become a thing? And so, kind of that sense of wonder you can have as being an outside advisor or being a startup advisor or having a non-CEO role, you kind of got to like clamp it down, I think, because otherwise the company will take on the appearance of chaos and disorganization.
And you're so spot on. It's not just like what you say, and it's also how you say it. And that was one of the craziest things for me is, again, I had been at AllTrails for 4 years. I'd hired everyone. You can see, like, I'm a very unfiltered person. I consider myself a very normal person. And, I get the CEO title, one letter in my title changes, but the entire dynamic around me shifted. And suddenly it took me a little while to realize is like, everyone looks at the CEO all the time. Like you're in a meeting, like even if people are talking, like someone might say something, but then they look at you to see how you respond. And it's just like, you are constantly the nonverbal cues that you don't even realize you're spitting out there, right? Like become part of like how people interpret, not just what you say, but how other people say things, the way you respond, the way you even like phrase a question and uplift someone or unintentionally like crush someone, right? And so like you have to, this was a skill, again, like no one tells you when you take the role for the first time, but if you're aware and self-aware enough, like you start picking it up pretty quickly. It's like so much of how you position yourself and posture yourself and your body language and your vibe and everything, like it really sets the tone through the entire org. And so you start becoming like, for me, like very self-conscious, but also like very hyper vigilant about how you are interacting in public with people.
Yeah, that's a massive learning. I've had to learn over the last year or so to put an asterisk with things I say as I'm saying it and realizing, wait, this isn't a fact. This isn't concrete. I'm just not that bright, and I'm just putting things out into the ether just to talk while we're running, while we're working on this together, without fully realizing that if it comes out of my mouth, this is now concrete, and people are now just going to have to do it. And so yeah, prefacing by saying, look, don't do this. This is just something that like I'm spitballing. And also, if there's something wrong with what I'm saying, please tell me. Don't just do it because I said so. Yeah, it's so interesting. And then you're totally right. You're setting the culture for the entire organization with everything where, I think when you're even one level lower, you can attack someone's ideas a little bit more directly. And it's like you're working through it together. It's a fun kind of like debate. It's a devil's advocate conversation. But now if it's the CEO attacking your ideas, it can be hurtful to that exact person, especially if it's seen by lots of people. And I'm very guilty of Slack bombing people. I'm like, let's do this out in public so everyone can learn. And not everyone is up for that. And also I get it. It's, when I was more junior, I would have maybe felt a certain way. That doesn't stop me from doing it 100% of the time, but it
one
just
tool
trying to be a little bit more mindful.
One tool I've definitely added to my toolkit, and I'm probably jumping the gun in the slides here a little bit, but it's the importance.
It's just a flowing conversation. So
cool. It's the importance of a unified front amongst the executive team. And I tell this to everybody, whether it's execs or just anyone, any direct reports, anyone who will listen to me, is like, don't surprise me in a meeting, right? I don't want to be caught flat-footed in a meeting, because then if I'm forced to react and it's not aligned, like, I know it's going to be crushing publicly. I don't want to do that. Right. So like, if there's any potential for misalignment, let's address this before we step into the room publicly together. And then when we're in the meeting, we're a unified front, right? And that's both for the boardroom, it's for all hands meetings, it's for product meetings, it's for strategy sessions, any of it. It's just like, that's the like, just don't surprise me in public. It's nothing good. And it's not like I'm, it's not like I have bad intention. It's just, again, like recognizing the weight of the title and how if you have to disagree or challenge or question, like just the weight that carries. I hate deploying that. Like, I hate seeing people like crestfallen, right? Because I had to say something, so it's just like a lot of proactive intentionality to get in front of it. That's worked really well, but it's an interesting tool that I've had to sort of develop over the years.
I like that a lot. And I think that's an area a lot of people can grow as well. Like, go through the chain of command is there for a reason. Go through them and trust them, and then have a little conversation with them before it gets deployed across everyone else. I like that a lot. Yeah, that's really great. We can jump into the next one. You both have talked about challenges a little bit through that last question. If there's any additional challenges that you think have been quite weighty, happy to dig in a little bit more deeply.
I think most of the time, I have a thought on that. So most of the time, I think there's a little bit of a myth that like a founder CEO is handing the reins to a non-founder CEO and like everything is fine. Something is not fine, like something, and that doesn't need to be like in a big red flag sense, but there's either a need for more tightness on operations, better jiggering in product market fit, more rigor on like financial planning and analysis. It can take a variety of forms, but the idea is whether it's been self-identified by the founder or it's been identified by the board, something is different. And I think one of the challenges as coming in as a non-founder CEO is you need to be pretty laser focused on figuring out like what you think the current state of affairs is and what needs to change for the future state of affairs, the state of affairs that are going to exist under you as a leader. And then over communicating that and working through it. And where I think there are issues, because I do some mentoring to like leaders at startups and things. And I think one of the things that I see as an issue is a lack of rigor around figuring out like what's going to be different or what needs to change, and then snapping a chalk line, talking to the board, engendering alignment, and then very clearly communicating it down to the org, and then kind of not gradually easing into that shift, but being, I think, pretty definitive with that shift. And I think that's a really challenging thing. It's a tough thing. It needs to be very EQ focused and delicate, because to some degree, the current employees have some degree of affinity to the old way of doing things. Presumably they weren't walking through the hallways with pitchforks and torches under the old leadership. And so you have to be delicate in how you do it. But I think kind of like posting or slow rolling into that type of transition, or not being very organized and definitive yourself as a leader, just leads to confusion, and the new way of operating never really announces itself. It's sort of crystallized.
That's really interesting, considering your answer there was sort of like the because what was like sort of the don't slow roll into it, don't just sort of ease your way really slowly, and like out of fear of whiplash, you're sort of like, well, if whiplash needs to happen, kind of go for it. Because I would think that general wisdom would say, go slowly, like ease people into it. Let's get them comfortable a little bit more slowly. You don't want them freaking out too much. What sort of leads to that of just do it, get in there quickly and do what needs to be done, versus even if you know what needs to be done, take it a little bit more slowly.
I think there's a spectrum of things, changes that you do. I think no matter what it is, even when you're being definitive and snapping that chalk line on the change, you need to be thoughtful and do your research in advance, but you need to have some degree of urgency in doing the research. So the moving fast doesn't mean don't be thoughtful and don't do research to the extent that's needed. But for instance, sometimes you're coming in and the board's been pretty clear, like, you know what, we need to, we're not measuring. I'll give you an example. We're not measuring ROI on the marketing side. We're overinvested on brand marketing with like a poor delineation of any sort of measurable KPIs for why we're investing in that. And we really need to get that. There's an example where like how it's done, make some changes here or there, but like, it's like, that's the thing. And the quicker you communicate that to the team and say, this is the change, we'll come back with more details. Because otherwise what's going to happen is people will sense changes happen, but you haven't said anything to them. And it's sort of like they're trying to intuit why the sort of gravitational pull in the marketing department or the marketing strategy has meaningfully changed. There's other stuff like, look, we don't think we have tight product market fit on our wholesale marketplace suite. Okay, well, you need to be thoughtful in that. You need to think, but when you're going to say there's a difference in strategy, though, you do need to be clear and kind of jump into that. I think there's I personally think it's a little bit of a myth that easing into some of these changes kind of allays employee fears or makes them feel calmer. Employees are really smart, especially in this era, and they will intuit stuff way faster than I think management teams typically give them credit for. So unless you're like the leading edge of communication and saying with firmness, here's the change and here's what's happening, they're going to take a couple of the dots and connect them and draw their own conclusions. And you may not like sort of what their assumptions are.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Don't treat them with child hands. Like they're grown adults. They see what's going on. They see the writing on the wall, and like very often they might be on the same page as you. Okay.
I think whether it's CEO or any exec role that you step into, there's for an established company, right? We're not talking about 0 to 1 startup. There's a window of opportunity that you get to enact change, and it slowly starts to close and calcify. And if you don't enact change in that period, then you are the one that gets pulled in to the previous way of doing things, right? The culture will eat you rather than you having the opportunity to change the culture or the processes or whatever it is, right? And there's just a calibration I think everyone needs to do, right? Like Chris's experience stepping into Weedmaps is just totally different from mine. And it's probably, you ask 100 different non-founder CEOs, you're going to get a huge spectrum of what they're stepping into, right? So it might require just a straight up table flip, like right out of the gate, like, this is broken and we are going to like rip it all, burn it down and start over. And others where it's like, this thing is smooth. We just had one issue here. I am a caretaker. I need to keep the waters calm and everything in between, right? But I think the key thing is the window, because that window does close. And again, every company is different. Maybe you have a couple months, maybe you have up to a year. But if you don't take advantage of that window, you lose it forever.
That's so fascinating. And I'd also imagine on top of that answer with that window, there's no real defined or easy way to know when is that window, how short is it, and what exactly needs to be done within that window. It's not an academic exercise where the professor is saying, well, you get 3 to 5 months here, and here's exactly what you should do in the 3 to 5 months.
Yeah,
So,
so much
so
is
how do you,
touch. It's touch, it's
yeah,
EQ, it's reading the room, it's reading your coworkers, right? It's like finger on the pulse. It's very squishy, it's a lot of intuition and sensing what's going on.
that's a really good point. When I've, one of the companies we worked with where they did bring in an outside CEO and it did not work out, he tried to really push science into every single decision, and took a very management consultant approach that process and science is going to get us every single which way. And his background before joining the organization as CEO was flawless. President of multiple well-known organizations. But when I talked to his internal employees, they were sort of like, you can't just management consultant your way to making this better and just add a bunch of processes and steps and layers. Like it's way more art than science, and how this thing is going to grow. And part of the art is knowing here's the people. It's like, I don't know, not everyone's into sports, but I think one thing that's really interesting about sports, I think every team and every single sport is unique, and you can't just plug and play one team's strategy with another team's strategy, because the talent that you have on your bench is completely different. You have to know how to utilize them. And that's not really science at that point. It's a lot more art, and really knowing the strengths, the heart, whatever. So yeah, I like that. I like what you say in it being squishy, because, oftentimes that's kind of the last thing people think of their traditional idea of a CEO, being squishy or understanding the squishy. It's always thought of as like going at everything with a gavel and a hammer. So no, I like that a lot.
You have to read the room. And I think there are two maxims to keep in mind on the change on that too, which is one, change costs money. So unless you have a really good reason for making changes on things, and sort of like way you used to do it at your last gig does not count, then you have to be careful making changes. And the other one is like expectation management. Like people, and there's tons of psychological studies on this, people better accept change if they understand the rationale for it and they've been pre-warned that change is coming. So like coming in early and being like, look, I'm the new leader here. Most likely there will be some changes, and being really careful not to say what those changes are, because you're just starting. You probably have no idea. So don't try and like wing it and guess, because then you're going to be viewed as flip-flopping and mercurial. But being clear in terms of expectation management, some stuff will change. I'm not here to sort of just kind of, stand at the wheel and kind of like hold my hand steady. Some stuff will change, and I'll be checking in with you as those changes start to become emergent. I think can be really helpful.
That's a great point. Yeah, it is that mixture of I'm going to make changes, but it's messy. I'm going to make changes, but we're going to work through exactly what they are. That's tough. Cool. Let's jump in the next one. This is an interesting one that we haven't touched upon too much. When you joined the companies that you joined and then ended up being promoted into the CEO roles, were there anything surrounding culture or values that you decided to say, I've taken a look at this and looking at the future where I'd like this organization to be, here's some things I don't really want to touch because they're wonderful, and here's some things that we should work through resetting. Or if you don't want to give your specific examples, things that you have learned that when someone is coming in as the new CEO, that you think requires some evaluation and potentially reshaping.
This one really speaks to me. Anyone who knows me I talk about this ad nauseum, that the two most important things for a company like AllTrails is momentum and culture. And as soon as you lose either of them, they're really, really hard to course correct and pick back up on. And I learned this the hard way with my first startup, right? And you look around, you think about like the takeoff like trajectory of companies. First it starts with product market fit and product channel fit. And if you can achieve either of those, then the next gotchas are culture and momentum. And if you lose, you look around all the zombie companies that are out there, like that's what happens, right? So when I got handed the role at AllTrails, like I said, you have this window, right? You get this mandate to enact change. And after, if you don't take it, it becomes impossible to do later. And I attacked the culture issue because the culture at AllTrails wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough. It wasn't right. And so that was a teardown for me, right? That was really the thing that got me out of my own head a little bit around the imposter syndrome, because I had worked at enough places and seen it. There's so many shitty CEOs out there, right? Like projecting confidence, projecting arrogance, having the archetype, like especially in tech, right? Like tech CEOs are put on this pedestal. There's like, it's obnoxious, right? It's obnoxious. And just because you fit this mold doesn't mean that like it's a healthy, positive culture, right? And so like at AllTrails, and I honestly, like, I think this is what has unlocked our growth, was this like focus on culture and what kind of company are we wanting, or do we want to be, right? You know, we've all read the articles and heard, you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's a little bit dramatic, but it's also like a little bit true, right? Like you can have on paper the right strategy, you know, but if your culture is risk averse, if your culture is afraid of making mistakes, you're never gonna achieve that strategy, right? And so like, I used this opportunity, I actually created like a culture deck. And it's like, here's what got us this far. Here's what we're gonna hold on to. And here's what's gonna change moving forward. And every month with all of our new hires, you know, when I took over as CEO, we probably had like, let's say like 18, 20 people. And we're 200 people today. So I still do this every single month with all the new hires. And I walk them through the culture of AllTrails, because we've grown and pulled in people from big companies and small companies and everything in between. You can't assume that they understand what it means, right? You know, for example, at AllTrails, because I care about momentum, I care about speed, I care about momentum. It's like, we're not going to let perfect get in the way of progress, right? Like, I don't want anything to be too precious. We don't always have the luxury of statistical significance. Sometimes we just need directional significance and we just need to move. Sometimes we just need enough gut intuition and we need to move, right? Like embracing failure. We're all doing stuff that's really, really hard. If it wasn't hard, there wouldn't be this amazing opportunity, which means there's no playbook, which means like we can't have a culture where people are scared of making mistakes. So they're going to get belittled. They'll get singled out. Then they turtle up, they shrink, and they won't extend themselves. They won't try the hard things that have like the big payout. And so it's like explicitly stating like we embrace our failures here. So long as we're not making the same mistake twice, then we're learning from it, right? We're learning, we're growing. This is how we get smarter. This is how we get stronger, right? I could go on and on about culture again. Like I have an entire deck, happy to show it you guys sometime. But to be like, this was like, I think the single most impactful thing that I probably had the opportunity to do as CEO is like explicitly define what is the culture of AllTrails, who do we hire, who do we partner with, who do we fire, right? Like objectively, what does success look like internally here? And there's this Bill Walsh, back to sports, like Bill Walsh, the old coach of the 49ers, he wrote this book, The Score Takes Care of Itself, right? And it's like, it's the culture that you set up, and then the outcome during the game it'll be fine. It'll work out, right? It's like the day-to-day habits, the way we interact with each other, the way we treat each other, the type of team we're building here, the type of commitment to excellence, whatever, what have you, that we're building in, like the outcome will be fine. You focus on the input metrics. And to me, again, like I think that's one of the biggest opportunities, because again, you get this window of opportunity to potentially make wholesale changes to things like culture.
That's amazing. I don't know if there's like one or two snippets of like culture that you added in that you might want to share, that you've been like, oh, this has been really cool in terms of putting this on paper and seeing it sort of, unearth itself in the organization.
I think,
I think you mentioned like healthy risk taking quite a bit.
Yeah, that's
so if there's
definitely
anything else beyond that.
Well, like I said earlier about everyone keying off of you and your energy and your vibe and your body language. And so, things like shining a light on others, right? Like I will never take credit for anything ever. There's no point. What's the point, right? What's the point? So taking that light and shining it on other people. And then other people see me doing that. And then they start doing that. We have this amazing culture at AllTrails of just like shining that light. And like, it gives people, they feel seen, they feel like they have an impact, right? Everyone, you hire good people, they want autonomy, they want agency, they want impact. And so like, okay, I can lead by example, and I can, through my actions, start creating a culture that provides that, right? Like micromanagement is actually like a great example of culture, right? And one of the things, again, as you go up the ranks, like there's no scale in micromanagement, and yet it's this impulse for so many bad CEOs out there who are scared of letting go. They won't let go, so they hold on tighter, and nothing, in my opinion, nothing good comes from that, right? So, for example, like setting the guardrails through OKRs or goals or whatever you have, like here are the guardrails. Now it's my job to get out of the way, right? So these are all like, they're cultural things though. And it comes often, you can explicitly state that, in a culture deck, but often so much of culture is really just leading by example.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. Cool. Chris, any ideas there of things that you've kind of jumped into in terms of culture and values of an organization?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's when I came in, there was a little bit of an issue with like a fear-based culture, and I think that was one thing that I focused on a lot, because it hurt the ability of people to innovate or make decisions on their own, and because fearful of the repercussions, or people don't like being yelled at, or like that sort of thing. But I mean, I think a couple things in the vein of speed. I think I often would say, don't let perfect be the enemy of 100 times better. And sort of being thoughtful, but also being quick and decisive on doing things. I think a lot of times coming in, so Weedmaps was an interesting one, because when I came in, there was and is, and it's pretty critical, I think, a lot of respect for the industry, where it came from, especially me coming in as like a suit. There was that, but I think at times what I found a little with the culture was there were some people who are more jazzed about the idea of like consuming cannabis versus making impactful solutions to make lives better for cannabis consumers and cannabis businesses. And it was like that little tweak, and it's not sort of eliminating, the awareness or the respect for the plant, for the farmers who kind of went through the years of federal prohibition. So there is that, but I think a lot of it is, and I think this touches on a lot of what Ron talked about, is not necessarily radically shifting values all the time. Sometimes it's shifting behavioral patterns. And I think those are slightly different things. So like getting to not letting perfect be the enemy of 100 times better isn't necessarily a value in and of itself, but it is a behavioral pattern, and getting people to switch that way. I think the other thing, I mean, the single biggest way that you as a new CEO are going to drive cultural change is hiring. Be clear what you like in the people that you work with, and then your hiring is going to fall into form in that. And you give it enough time, and that will naturally bend the evolutionary arc of the company. So like, I too agree. I think micromanaging is a real issue. It hurts scalability, the inability to delegate things. It frankly makes being a CEO much more painful, because people will come and ask you everything. But I do, as a leader, like the concept of micro awareness. So I think leaders should understand how every cog in their org works from the bottom and up to the top. Like if you're running a sales org, there's no excuse to not be periodically auditing sales calls. That doesn't mean you're in there, coaching that individual person or doing whatever. But I do think, and so for instance, that's a value that I believe in, because I think it helps as you scale and get bigger, if leaders kind of understand how things work. But in terms of how you make and affect that change, it's writing, being clear, as Ron said, writing down the stuff that are the values or the behavioral patterns you want to see, making sure that's really baked into your hiring process as well as your onboarding process once people come aboard. And then over communicating. I think that's a common theme with being a new CEO, is over communicate everything. Make sure your reports are over communicating everything. And I think that's
Chris,
how you kind of bake.
I think you're so spot on the hiring side. So much of what we do as CEO is really like, it's org design, right? Like, do we have the right people? Are we assembling the best team possible? It's not, sometimes you're like a GM of a team kind of thing. And, when you take over the reins as CEO, a big part of it is assessing the team that you have, right? And like, who is willing to come along with me for the ride? And, there are gonna be people that aren't willing to go there with you, right? That are gonna like dig their heels in and maybe entrench. And that's where often like some of the roots of toxicity kind of creep in. And so equally important with hiring is also like weeding those people out. And I think that that's a huge part of shaping the culture is, again, like, there is a cost in ripping people out. There absolutely is. There's a cost of momentum. There's a cost of institutional knowledge. Like you lose a lot when you have to transition people out. But at the same time, there are some people that will, that are just diametrically opposed to the culture that you're trying to create. And, it's up to you as a CEO to determine whether or not they're allowed to be there or not, right? Whether it's a net positive or negative. And I think knowing how, who, and when to transition out is a key part of shaping the culture.
Actually, I mean, and maybe we're jumping a little ahead in the slides, but I found two things on that, because I think on one hand, it's sort of like you come in, you're like, here's where we're going, here's what we want to do, or here's the strategy. And there are people who just, I don't believe in that, or, whatever. And yeah, you have to make that decision, like, because I think as much as they may say, believe in that, I'll like play the part, we're all human. And it's, most of us are very hard at like playing pretend and stagecraft, like every working day, whatever. And so if they can't eventually actually believe in that strategy and mission, it becomes a real problem. And it's through all this stuff, Ron was talking about meetings, body language, leaning out, that little scowl, whatever. And so you do have to think carefully about that. I think the other pattern I've seen that I haven't always been the greatest at going after, and I'm now more mindful of it, is there's someone who there's a new pattern of thinking with the new strategy, like, oh, if this isn't, if this isn't going to lead to, a lower cost of acquisition, we don't want to do it in our product roadmap. And people kind of getting it, but then every time there's a new decision that needs to be made, they choose the wrong door because they keep forgetting, like, we're optimizing for cost of acquisition. It's a more subtle type, and it's not digging in heels. It's just an inability to think and make strategic decisions based on the new North Star strategy. And that one's like a little harder. And it really is like, it also is cancerous to an org, because somebody you should be delegating to and can make decisions autonomously now can't, because their natural bias is towards the wrong answer based on the new strategy. And that I found is one that I'm trying to be more thoughtful of, because it doesn't announce itself loudly, like somebody just saying, no, I disagree with where we're going.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned the subtlety, and then I would even say, even venture as far as saying a little messy, even with that communication, right? Because on one side you have, okay, look, this is where we're going as an organization now that I've taken the reins, here's the vision. But then on the flip side, what you don't want is someone then not offering their expertise and pushback against you when they're like, well, actually, here's some of my thoughts on your vision. And that's where it gets a little bit, they might be a little bit worried at that point, like, well, maybe a couple of my colleagues might be moved out of this organization because they're not on board. Maybe I keep my mouth shut. It's a tight and unique and difficult communication challenge, where you need to tell people, look, here's where we're going as an organization, but I still value your opinions. And frankly, if you have a lot more expertise in a lot of these areas, which you probably do, if you're, let's say, the VP of product, give them to me. Let's work on this together. But it's difficult because there's a thin line playing across all of these little areas. So there's some interesting, like, thin ice between being collaborative and communicative and combative. But collaborative and communicative is often saying, I actually think you're missing this point here, or I kind of think this could be a little bit better. Let's kind of riff on this together. Versus just like, no, this is the way we've done it. Why are you making my life difficult? I had a really good gig before. I really enjoyed it. I got to do these 3 things that I really enjoyed. And it's sort of like, well, that's why we're in a little bit of an issue now. So it's really thin ice that you can fall very deeply into if the communication is difficult. And you're not communicating right to those people, and they're not communicating right back to you. And, those other people are not sitting in the CEO seat. So your level of communication needs to be, multiples better than theirs, because you are sitting in a higher seat, and that is your job to do that. So yeah, I don't know if I gave any solutions there, but it's just messy.
Well, I'll give you one concrete example, because I think, at least it sounds like Ron and I are kind of wired the same way, that we like to foment healthy debate on things, and you don't want to just sort of make it a dictatorship, because then you lose scalability through delegation and all this. But like, just to give you an example, at one point I'd made a decision, based on the data, that a certain customer segment was not valuable for us to pursue. And that's sort of like a preset tenet. Like, that is a strategy decision. Like, we don't believe going after this customer segment is valuable. And I remember there was somebody in debating, and it's sort of like the thought patterns, given that this customer segment isn't valuable as one of many inputs, we're making a decision on marketing or on product or whatever. And I remember I had somebody who kept coming back to me like, well, I don't agree with this decision. And the root cause was because they were like, because I think we should go after this customer type. And there's only so many times you can be like, we've made the decision that this customer segment isn't valuable, before it's like, all right, we got to do something different here. And so there's the difference, but it's sort of like, you can debate the strategy given the tenets and the reality that you've sort of set as your North Star stuff. But if part of making those strategy decisions is people coming back and trying to like relitigate those like kind of North Star decisions and tenets, like, that's where you've got like a huge problem. And it's just like, look, we can't come back and be redebating this customer segment thing every month. Like, it's insane. It's demoralizing to employees. It's not productive. And so I think there's an example of like, debate away on the other stuff down below. But if it's coming back on this broad like North Star strategy thing, unless you have like a radically new data point that we didn't have before or whatever, like, either get in line or get off the boat.
This is why I think it's so important to have alignment among the executives, right? So like, hash that out behind closed doors. And then you need to empower your deputies to do some of the hard no's out there. So it doesn't, because it's soul crushing when it comes from the CEO, right? But if it can go down the chain of command, it can be a lot more productive and healthy.
Yeah, definitely. And it actually reminds me of a conversation I had with, and we're at time here, but I'll dig into this really quickly. I actually met with Ron, what is it, like 6 years ago, maybe even more, when he was just joining as a CMO. And one of his tenets at that point was, we don't do paid customer acquisition. Look, we got a massive amount of uniques. We're doing really well. We're going to monetize. And it was just like, we don't do that. And I was like, wait, but why? It's like, oh, just not part of what we do. A year later, I talked to him. Oh man, we're crushing paid customer acquisition. We're growing so much faster now. And it's like, awesome. You had something that was like, yeah, we just don't do that. We don't need it. Our business doesn't need it. We have so many uniques. And it's like, oh no, now this works. You took something that was previously precious, re-evaluated it, and was like, yeah, it's good. It's going good.
I like having strongly held opinions loosely held, right? Like, I got opinions for days, but also I acknowledge, like, I don't know shit. What do I know, right? Like, anything beyond the data, it's just intuition or hunch or maybe some pattern matching. But like, and this is part of the culture at AllTrails. Like, I love being wrong, and I will freely admit and publicly, and I love it. I take joy in it and being proven wrong. And I think that, again, like, it feeds into our culture in a really healthy, productive way, right? And it enables people to go out and, like, just because we do something a certain way doesn't mean we need to keep doing it that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it shows that you're capable of doing that. So I want to thank all of our attendees here for coming and listening in here. Hopefully there were some valuable tidbits you took away. And of course, I want to thank our panelists, Ron Schneidermann and Chris Beals, for spending an hour with us and teaching us so much. This is the end of our session. And again, thanks a lot to everybody.